Albert Pope. You want to know who I am? I listed in the bulletin. I'm a professor at Rice School of Architecture, and will be speaking shortly. Ross asked me to coordinate a discussion between the speakers today, saying, Albert, it's not such a big deal, just think of a few questions. So now I'm going to try to coordinate Peruvian anchovies, the voices of Des Moines poverty housing, the colossal pyramid made of trash, the draining of the Mediterranean, and the hotels of John Portman. Which I think is kind of characteristic of an urban conference, at least the ones that I've been to. It's a catch-all. And in some ways, it's our job to try to focus and isolate and make sure that within the broad range of everything we call urban, that the things that we care about and bring us to these conferences don't get dissipated along with these dissipated interests. And I think I will rely on Ross's formulation of the interior and of the global interior, and maybe just ask one question, but follow on with a few more. When did the world in quotation marks, become a problem? When did we start thinking about the world as a problem, as a totality, as something that we could generate discourse around? Antonio called it Weltbauen, or world building. It's an interesting question because it's something that is relatively new, I think, what you heard today. And it is accompanied by a kind of paradoxical question, which is, what does this have to do with an interior? Right? Because the world is kind of the ultimate exterior. How do we couple a kind of global awareness or global thinking with an interior, which seems to be its antithesis, right? And I think the various passes that you've heard made today start to, in some ways, suggest what that connection is. You've heard a lot about discussions about the creation of an exterior, right? You can't create an interior without also creating an exterior at the same time, and of how significant that is, especially when you're thinking on it at a global scale. What does it mean then to create this exterior? What it means is that as we focus on an interior, as we interiorize our processes, our buildings, our networks, what are we producing? We are producing a kind of exterior that we can, in some ways, exploit with impunity. We're producing an outside, in some ways that the catchphrase, I think, in some discourses is an inside without an outside. That we become so focused on the interior that we produce an exterior that is in some ways invisible. I think a lot of the discussions today have been about making that exterior that is invisible visible. Right? The discussions of the operational landscape, the discussions of trash, where does trash go, the discussion of the populations that are on the outside. I think implicit in Charles's discussion of John Portman, the exterior that Atlanta became once it became interiorized. I think the question then is, as the kind of paradox now of world and worldly thinking and interior kind of comes together in a way of thinking through what this new exterior presents us with. There's a term that I believe Ross already mentioned. That's Peter Sloterdijk. He is a philosopher, and philosophers have a way of inventing words and then assigning their own meanings to them, which can be infuriating for us non-philosophers. But it's useful. His word is explication. And it's not like explain. It's a little more complicated than that. It's what he's trying to get across with explication, and I'll refer to it in more detail in a moment, or in my lecture, is that what used to be background, what we used to be able to take for granted, we can no longer take for granted. We used to assume that the air is healthy, crops will grow, trash will disappear, water is everywhere and clean, there will always be fish in the sea. All of these things that were once taken for granted must now become discursive, right? They have to be the object of study. And he is more or less arguing that that's what modernism has, as a project, has always been, about taking the base levels, of the most basic levels of human existence, and making them explicit. So I think what's happened in the course of this global thinking and global interior is that we produce this exterior. And in some ways it has become invisible, but it cannot be invisible anymore. And much of explication is actually about saying what is going on in this exterior, what are its limits, and the fact that in the long run of things, this exterior is a kind of fiction, right? That there is no outside. I think Rania said it. There's no there, over there, that we can assume. So I think in order to, my attempt here is maybe a little bit of a stretch, to say that this interior, which is actually key to all our organizations, right? That we do function in quite extensive and elaborate interiors, has produced this outside. And this outside is now pushing back on us in the most noteworthy sense in the climate problem. How we go about addressing that. So I don't have, I think it, in some ways that relates, for example, to once Portman put his skywalks into place, the city around it was transformed. It was transformed into a kind of exterior. Once consumerism started producing an unbelievable volume of trash, and that trash started to accumulate in the Pacific Gyre and in the landfills around our cities, in outer space, as you said. How I think it's a very beautiful discussion of those implications. And I think the operational landscapes that we discussed are an attempt to bring those into play. Right? The ultimate interior is the 3.5% of the 7% that we call urban, right? The 70%, the 3.5% of this, if I got it right, 3.5% of the 70% of the world that we occupy is urban. That's the ultimate interior. And how we put all of that other stuff into play I think maybe a framework that would be useful to you guys, and maybe something that one of you might be willing to pick up on.
I can add something to that, certainly. One attempt that I found very influential when I was doing this work, and connecting it to the question of, did all this preoccupation with understanding what is outside. So there was a series of articles by Benton McKay, already from the 30s. He calls them the new exploration, and his framing is something like, in the pre-Columbus age, all the conquest of the world, all the exploration of the world, had to do with actually, mapping what is there. Now we know what is there, but we don't really know how it works. We are kind of blind. So this industrial organization of the whole, planet was becoming so complicated that he was claiming it required a new type of exploration, not an exploration of islands and oceans, but an exploration of systems, of how systems relate to physical processes, to social processes. And he called this the new exploration, the terra incognita, a different type of terra incognita. We need to explore it. So I think this connects also to what you framed very, very successfully, Rania, as the two aspects in your work. But one is actually making things visible, and the agency of design is making things visible. So, conquering this terra incognita through, removing its obscure nature. But I think the most tricky part is how you can actually intervene and how you can actually reimagine, reshape the world. So I would say there are two questions then. When the world became a problem, when the world became a problem as something that we need to actually, explain and visualize and understand, and when, actually, if the world is a matter of, design, design, think, let's see, you can see these ambitious visions already, but it seems that now we need such a comprehensive strategy more than ever. I mean, with most of the problems that we have being increasingly and all the design, planning, discourse supporting, the bottom up, it seems that there is a gap in an imaginary, at least, that is a very, global design-based vision of how the world could be reshaped.
Technical interruption for a minute. Can we maybe cut the microphones and just use this? Is that possible? There's a connector? Oh, okay. Okay, here.
I'm basically, this is what I wanted to say. So it's not really answering to anything in particular, but it's kind of my problematic as well. Also in relation to why it is relevant to have such a conference in an architecture school.
So maybe one way to think about it, because we spoke about anchovies earlier, well, along with seeing a big fish on screen making me hungry after lunch. What that made me think of was the Pacific world as something that we started to care about, to label as such, and to engage in a new territorial designation to that ocean around guano, or one of the earliest form of fertilizers, and the trade between the Southern Americas and the future markets. So words get constructed as we assign, seems, some value into them within our exchange system, and start moving things around. Maybe what I'd like to think of the interior is almost opportunistic in that respect. It's almost like a technology of care, or strategy to reassume a certain tidying up of the household. And I'm worried, I mean, I ventured there, but I'm worried about maybe the conservatism in terms of understanding of ecology that might entail, of the oikos again being part of the conversation. But it seems that part of an interior is making sure you keep it up and tidy, that you care about it, that there's a certain agency that either manages that place, or maybe to use a more broader term, cares for that place. So maybe what thinking of the urban as an interior could start to do for us is to reassert care over that word beyond kind of a question of whether it's a problem, that maybe some part of it is our relationship. And there might be a challenge with that scalar dissonance that we have between the grand questions of ecology at this point and our individual capacity to relate and respond to that, both a cognitive capacity. How do we make sense of that garbage patch that's traveling across the ocean? But also, what do we do about it? And maybe because this is something we're thinking of now, that garbage patch in a project, we started thinking of some of these strategies that could make you care. And some of those are actually devices that represented that world out of all places in domestic interiors, for example, or in large public spaces. So this is the commission that we're developing for the Oslo Triennale called the Pacific Aquarium, which actually hopes to bring some of that larger Pacific Ocean and some of its broader ecological questions back to a scale where you can relate to it as an aquarium. So to assert maybe some of these technologies in a similar way maybe to what the drawings do representationally, but to look into these objects where you can claim again a word, a care for that word, and a certain subjectivity in relation to it.
There is, though, a flip side to that domestication, I think, because that movement of bringing home is precisely, I think, the movement that Sloterdijk points out with the world of commodities brought into a particular relationship to the domestic around consumption. So I think that there are two sides of a coin that are fused together. The domestication of the world problem, or the problem of the world, is both the mechanism of the world problem in a way. So those two things probably will always be rotating around each other.
So if it seems that we've already done the first flip of the coin, maybe you might as well benefit from taking the care aspect of it and saying, what the hell, let's try and see if there's something in that.
But it seems to me that we keep flipping the coin and keep flipping and flipping. I mean, I think I want to pick up what you said about tidying things up. That to me, if I use the example of Sergel and the way he kind of tidied up the Mediterranean, to me, I think it becomes a question of human territoriality. I think Robert Sack kind of like has this beautiful book about that. And the question here for me would be like flipping the coin to me in this conversation is kind of like what you refer to as explication. The way like Sloterdijk keeps saying, okay, we keep explicating, and now are we flipping the coin to kind of like just changing the discourse in a different way, or as this lady over there talked about, trying to think about new technologies in the way we engage with the problems that are at hand. And not technologies per se as technology, but maybe new ways in which we engage with things. So that we think like we keep kind of inventing technologies to kind of solve the problems and invent a new technology, but I think, are we flipping the coin right now to kind of like start looking at things in a different way? Or is it just kind of like another form of explication?
Yeah, I think Maybe an interesting question is also to look at, when did the world matter for designers and for architects? So I think Antonio, you sort of talked about that, but I think there is also the legacy from the Tendenza, Vittorio Gregotti with the La Forme du Territoire, and starting to think about large scale in a way that maybe is connected with aesthetics and is connected with other issues that are not only technocratic. And so I think this is also a part of our work at Designer, is to see how design can sort of become an agent of change, and how we can maybe instrumentalize the drawing itself, or the installation. Rania, you talked about the aquarium, as a way to sort of engage the audience or engage the public into a conversation, and a conversation that is not only about numbers or calculations, but that is also about emotions and about things that we should care about.
Still work? No? Oh, it does?
Oh, it does.
Okay. Magic. I think I was just going to respond to a couple of those. The flipping of the coin is interesting, that we could explain things and invent new technologies to explain them. And I think the thing that may be different, that may have been started with this world thinking, is that the finite capacity of the world has been acknowledged and understood and is pressing back on us, and that the endlessly flipping the coin no longer seems to be an option. Or as we move through the 20th century up to today, that flipping is being revealed in its ineffectuality. That may in fact give explication, which I think is really related not to addressing an old problem, but to address a problem that we never had to address before, like fresh air, right? Or clean water. Fresh air in Beijing, or clean water in Flint, right? However you want to say it. In some ways, the coin flipping, I think Sloterdijk's attempting to in some ways say that we have been flipping the coin, and circling the same set of subjects without coming back to it. But it's an interesting, the danger is always there, that we create a new technology out of this ontological speculation, right, of concern about climate change. For example, these whack schemes where you're going to see the clouds with sodium nitrite to reflect the sun back into the heat back into space, which would be humorous if they weren't being advanced by Nobel scientists. But that this flipping, where we create a problem but we solve a problem and create one, and solve one and create one, and solve one and create one, I think is maybe the subject of, or at least what I think Sloterdijk's intention is to put that kind of cycle to an end, which is by drawing a baseline at these background functions that we've never had to think about before. The interior and care is quite beautiful, right? That by internalizing something, we see it and care about it. We can care about it, right? Like an aquarium. We don't care about the ocean because, hell, it's too big to even conceive of. And I'm sure that would not sound well out of context, but I think part of the design, part of thinking about the world as design has to do with seeing things that we haven't seen before. You don't really worry, are there Are there fish in the ocean, right? Well, the highest extinction rate, species extinction rate, is in the ocean, not on land, because of the acidification of the absorption of too much carbon. Anyway, we don't give a shit about that, or we don't think about that, because the ocean is the ocean. It's always there, eternal. Now we have to think about it. How do we think about it? Well, queer. I mean, it's a very nice, not only it's a nice way to think about the interior, it's also a really nice way to think about design and the role of design. And actually, I think a pretty good definition of explication. An aquarium, in the context that Ronnie was discussing, is a way to see an ocean, right? Is a way to see and understand an ocean, see and understand a problem that we've never had to understand before, at least not in the same way. And that is design. Right? The role of design hasn't been the role of design, I don't think, or at least not clearly the role of design up until recently. But it's certainly a provocative, let's say a provocative new role for design, going beyond the abstract numbers, was mentioned, the abstract numbers, the white papers, the newspaper reports, the fact that I just gave you a pretty boring statistic about how the species extinction rate, how do you actually see that, right? That's a design problem. Do you guys have questions out there?
There's a question out there. Grab our universal microphone, bring it up there.
I wanted to pursue a little bit the idea of the aquarium. And it's the oceans are an aquarium, literally. That is to say that we are, if you like, the custodians of this vast aquarium, which we don't know how to run and which we are destroying. And it is our aquarium, like it or not, because we determine the life world conditions of every other species in the world. And so I guess what I'd love to see you all pursue this, and for the terrestrial equivalent, it is a zoo, and it is a real zoo. I mean, we're the most successful invasive species in world history. There are 8 billion of us, right? And we determine the life world conditions of all the terrestrial species. And so the world is, in fact, a zoo. And maybe the miniaturization that you suggest of kind of zoo, aquarium, I'm sure there are other ways one could expand this, is a useful way of thinking, not just as a metaphor, but as a physical condition of the survivability and life world of all the Earth species, in which we are, to say once again, we're incompetent zookeepers who have found ourselves the custodians of aquariums and zoos that we don't know how to run, and which are undoing themselves with mostly our help.
Maybe it's more
I just want to dive back in and kind of put an irritant into the mix a little bit, because I think to think that way, I think we have to think about the modernity of that thinking, or let's say the historical specificity of that thinking, that would say that we understand the world by its domestication, which, as I said before, is precisely the process, the mode of thinking by which the world becomes a problem for us, right? So I would sort of want to reiterate that it's a process of interiorization and is driven by the domesticity of modern thinking, which itself produces the world as a problem that is made visible still within the domesticity of our thinking, which to me is the world problem in a way.
No, I mean,
It got me thinking of whether, like, the way we relate to the word and our place within it as a species, whether this is more of a, somewhere sort of a safari park turned hunting ground, kind of this, the endless story of the lion and the hunter on the safari park. Who do we care about in that story? But it's almost thinking of the miniaturization of nature and what forms we give them somehow speaks to the forms of care. And I guess this is where, again, the metaphor of the domestic is relevant. It's more of a question of how do you make people care about an issue? Because it seems that the route of pure logic or pure statistical information, and this is a route that architecture took, and very significantly with the stream of forensic architecture, the role of the detective that produces forms of evidence that's capable of standing in a court and speaking the language of law. And this is an important route. The restriction is that this remains a highly professional discourse that could appeal to specialists. But if you are to assume that there is agency at the scale of world citizens, then you need to be able to build up a discourse that speaks to that broader public. And this is why it's an opportunistic form of political discourse that the professional is aware of. So I guess the caveat is, we know the caveats of that form, but if we are to say that, well, for most of world citizens, we've done a good job to the best of our capacity in keeping our interiors clean, somehow, of tidying it up. If we are to expand, if we're capable to expand that scale of thinking, not just to the scale of our immediate inhabitation, but to broader scales, then there might be something in the technologies of the domestic kind of miniaturization. And I guess the mundanium came up earlier in the conversation, and that's one example that comes up that might be at least worth exploring a bit. Maybe it would turn out to be, it has its own loopholes, but it's more of a dive into some possibility.
I mean, I don't want to be very provocative with it, but one could say that in another way to see it would be that there is perhaps too much management of nature by humanity. Already, all the environmental discourse, I think it's shifting from the conservation to this idea of managing the environment, stewardship, environmental stewardship. And I always find it very, very interesting to see, let's say, the numbers. You can think that there are a few million wolves or wild mammals like lions and things like that. There are like billions of cows, there are billions of pigs, billions of chickens that we actually are in industrial farms. I mean, the magnitude, the order of magnitude is like more than 2,000-3,000 times more animals that are domesticated, more land that is actually, its vegetation is used for our nourishing, all these things. I mean, it seems that wildlife or the conservation of the environment, as the idea of nature, is an insignificant part of the actual conservation of nature, which is actually already happening. So we are managing a lot of nature. We are actually managing most of it. It seems that we are managing it very well in order for it to suit our current needs. I'm not sure if it's the correct way, but I would say the problem is the overwhelming of management rather than the non-existent management of nature. And it always ties back to political questions and questions of production and what we are doing. I think another way to frame Sloterdijk's argument would be through another angle of world political ecology, let's say, which says that basically the limits to humanity do not have to do with resources, have to do, with capitalism and the growth strategies and growth production processes, things like that. And basically, climate change is the actual frontier. It's not, how much land we have. It's not how many resources we have. It's actually that climate change is scaling back our ability to take advantage of this ecological surplus that is there. And it's making everything more and more expensive, and it's creating less and less possibilities for growth. This is probably a bit more specific. I'm probably playing Nikos against Anton a little bit, but the fact that these representations, planetary organizations, I'm not sure it's a question as much as, I see in every representation some strategies for intervention. And if these representations end up shaping in the way we think about intervention, that would create the red bound that Antonio was talking about in the previous time. So when the word is divided into 4 categories, and then we start to think about it through 4 categories, and we see math through 4 categories, how much do you think that shapes our imagination of how to intervene in a place like India, similar to a place like Norway? Similar to, and then it establishes a discourse of word unity, which homogenizes more and marginalizes the specifics. Just the way, for example, human organizations use the word slums everywhere in the world in a similar way to designate something that needs to be corrected, or UN habitat terminology and so on. So how much do you think there are something to worry about when we reduce the whole word into 4 categories, or even 8? I think that's an excellent question, and in fact, one part of my reaction has to do with the use of data and the overwhelming overabundance of data and of actual means of quantitatively grasping what is there. The second has to do with actually the agency of representation. So in my case, 2 things. First of all, I acknowledge completely this need to understand that every actual representation of geography has a certain meta-geography. It means it has a precondition according to which it is conceived, and also it has an agency in relation to what's going to happen next. In my case, what I wanted to accomplish was not really establish a new order that is going to take over the previous order of the urban and non-urban, but actually add more things into the mix, and so actually through my gradient maps how actually these categories cannot be delineated very linearly. So I mean, it's not really introducing 4 categories, it's actually introducing 4 corners, 4 extremes, and accepting that the world is actually a mix of all these things. The second thing, however, that I think is kind of missing, and has to do with the whole local global understanding of the world, is that I actually think that there needs to be such a macroscopic interpretation of the world as well, without, of course, cancelling the local specificities that are there. So my position is that you can never have the whole picture anyway. However, what we are seeing recently is that more and more people are very much invested in understanding the world from the bottom up, and this is a very important and very useful thing to do. Emphasizing the differences of places, the differences of cultures, and how these actually have agency in the conditions of globalization. There is something like a fear of creating these macroscopic interpretations and categorizations of the world, because they might be connected to very authoritarian interpretations of solutions, and I would agree with that. However, I think that there is a lot of way that these things can meet somehow in the middle, and the one with the other can found themselves in a dialectical relationship. So I don't have a position that I am the person who is going to create new indicators, new classifications of the world, although this is actually what is mostly happening if you see environmental studies. They are very much invested in reclassifying the world, reclassifying anthropogenic landscapes, socio-ecological types of landscapes and things like that. I'm not so much interested in doing that. My purpose was mostly undo a condition rather than introducing a new, very rigid, fixed set of categories. But yes, I mean, I think overall I agree with you that there is a certain agency on all these representations necessarily. The one thing that I always find interesting is that there is a lot to gain if you actually accept that these things are somehow both politically and maybe ideologically contested, And if all this is very evident, where is the starting point, what is the agency of this, then perhaps you are still able to take advantage of what the image, what the map tells you. I think the problem is when all these things get obscured and when maps or representations present themselves as reflections of reality as it actually is. And I think this is the big problem. If you actually accept that all these are ideological constructions, socio-technical constructions, I think there is a lot of room to take advantage of what they can offer you. But I saw it also in my work. I saw this fetishism of resolution, meaning the highest resolution data, the better understanding we have of the world. And I came to appreciate very much, actually, the nature of abstraction and the power of abstraction. Actually, and also it connects also with the work that you are doing. After a point, it doesn't actually tell you anything to increase the resolution of what you are doing. You don't really get a better image of the world. You just get a finer grain of what you already know that you're going to find. What we actually need is these abstract categories that will allow us to reorganize the knowledge that we think we have into different types of knowledge.
I'm going to try to illuminate your question from a little bit of a different perspective, because it seems to me that we keep continuing looking at the world through all these lenses, but we keep not understanding it from, like, we keep flipping the coin. Let me use this terminology again. I think, let's use the Mediterranean as an example. Sergo just came and tried to tidy it up and kind of reorganize the entire region with this big plan, this big master plan. Here we go, we're going to change everything. But I think in thinking about the Mediterranean is a geography, it's a larger geography. It's not Italy or Spain or parts of the Northern African Rim. It's like a lot of things. It means a lot of things. And I think you cannot just go and come and tidy it up with a plan like this. And this is a little bit what's missing in the conversation, at least from my perspective, is one, I would love to hear like a non-Western perspective of the subject. I mean, it's kind of missing to me, because it seems we are all talking about the same things. Basically an exterior perspective of it, and then also this notion of the human being within all these things we're talking about. What is the role of the human being within everything we do? We can map and map and map, but like, what does it actually at the end of the day mean? So are we just creating more natures that are basically, again, Robert Stack is this really wonderful geographer that talks a lot about nature as a museum. I mean, and the more we keep talking about it, and the more we keep kind of like throwing these things around, it seems to me we're creating more and more museums, and again, more and more interiorizing what's left. So I mean, basically I would love to, maybe tomorrow there will be somebody giving a perspective from a non-Western perspective. That would be nice. Or just like as a perspective that is non-Western. Let's say a speaker would be more on the things, but like somebody that speaks from, I heard India, like I would love to see what somebody from India thinks about the things, the way we talk about territorialization, the way we keep organizing the world, the way we kind of like manage data. I would just be curious to hear what their perspective is on the subject.
Yeah, Antonio, yeah, I think also there is a kind of basic question with geography and representation when we talk about the large scale, and how the large scale is often connected to power, and how can we sort of start to think about large scale things. And this puts us in situations that maybe are sometimes tricky. I very much like maybe to bring the example of Humboldt, who was a geographer who was looking at mountains and volcanoes, and in particular Cotopaxi mountain, so he would sort of travel, and through his experiential journeys, he will make drawings, and he would make drawings of larger geographies, and he would even go beyond the earth and talk about the cosmic. And he would define his drawings as a microcosm on a sheet of paper. So somehow I think it can be, we can sort of through drawing and through maybe experiential type of translation, we can sort of avoid kind of political complexity of facing large scale.
Choose myself to speak. I think this question, I just been reflecting on the bigger question of how do we view the world. And one problem with the world is maybe that we see it as the world. And I mean, there are other, perhaps not non-Western, but philosophical interpretations of the idea of world as something like Kostas Exelos would talk about as a kind of an opening out to new ideas, a new sort of relations and so forth. Heidegger also, of course, talks about the world not being but worlds. And so, I mean, the other thing is that we're talking about the world in singular, the world, proper noun. And I think it could be fascinating because of this sort of paralysis that a problem at the scale of the world presents itself with. Maybe a kind of a way into this, or to the problems that we are representing at the world scale, is to kind of forget the world scale also, the planetary scale, I should say, and to imagine the world or worlds in a very different way as kind of breaking out, opening into new configurations of life and so on. We still have some time for some more.
I have a remark about the non-Western perspective. Who would that token non-Western be? A slum dweller, a social scientist working for a major university in India somewhere, or an Indian working here in the US in an Ivy League school. For me, there's a problem of this categorization of the non-Western versus Western knowledge, because historically speaking, there has been a domestication, internalization all over the world. So the non-Western, in an idealized way, would be a person that was never exposed to anything Western, and that doesn't exist. So I just wanted to, this is coming from my own research and my own reservations about this kind of categories, and but I do think that epistemologically there are many interesting questions to be asked, such as what is nature, and how nature is perceived by different societies. And anthropology is doing a lot of work on this, I'm pretty sure. And I think that the entire home question can be asked in relation to this question. So it is an opening, and at the same time I just want to make my own reservations of pedestrializing it on a stand and giving it an aura of something that can rescue us.
We'll let you do the running. Thanks. I want to take us back to the aquarium for a minute, because I'm just going to pose a kind of big question, which is, do you think by using that metaphor that somehow people are going to respond differently to the question? Because I keep thinking about other examples where we think logic will win out, or we think that data is going to change people's perceptions. So this is a totally unrelated thing, but I've been very struck in the news about how now that in New York City they post the calories of food items on the menu, that people expected that this was going to make people order food that had fewer calories. But this is part of the effort to kind of make people healthy. And the research says, in fact, that they order more worse food now. they know the calories, but they can tell that they get the food that has more calories. Maybe the information itself is a kind of power, I don't know. And so I guess for me the question is, what does the aquarium metaphor do? Because, I'm just wondering about it's a bit utopian to think that I'm all with Charles on this issue of domestication, because I think that we imagine that if we turn something into a smaller chunk, if that makes it, like we miniaturize the issue, that now all we're doing is trying to fix the aquarium, that somehow this is going to give us a different answer. And to me, I'm not sure that that's true. I think we're kind of reproducing the problem, which is that we're trying to imagine that there is a solution that is within the reach of people like us who are sitting in a room and talking about it. I'll also go to the kind of Marxist side of things and say that if we can't reach the true infrastructures that are creating all these problems, if we really can't change the way global capital flows, and with trash, we know that the global flow of trash is about the overproduction of the developed world sending trash into the less developed world to a certain degree. It just seems to me that some of these issues are so deep in our entire global system that the aquarium metaphor looks, that in that big context, it looks sort of paltry to really get at some of the issues.
Does that mean we should do it?
No, I guess I don't know. Of course we need to try, but I'm just asking sorry. Of course we need to try. I'm a bit of a cynical person, but I think that I'm asking the question because there seemed to be a kind of aha moment around this idea of the aquarium, and I think that Charles is saying he wants to throw an irritant in there. I also want to throw an irritant in that way, to ask whether we need to be addressing ourselves to these bigger questions of means of production. And I don't want to be Marxist in a literal sense, but to say, do we need to talk about who's controlling all these mounds of trash and why they get sent to Africa, or all these kinds of questions that the individual person can't on their own kind of address.
I'd say, if I can just jump in on that too, I think a lot of the discussions we have today about sustainability and resilience tend to focus on the sort of magic of awareness. And this makes problematic also the notion of exploitation, which, and in all of these things, exhibition, excavation, making visible, it's part of what we do when we make discourse. But I guess the question is, to what extent can we rely on that as the sole kind of limits of agency, when basically what it is framing a kind of problem as the problem that relies or rests on the shoulders of the individual. So in a way, it's all framed within a kind of neoliberal. Here.
So I love the fact that somehow Marxism is coming to the table, because this is where some of the work is in conversation with. There's definitely an increased interest in writing histories of capitalism at this point, and the relations to nature are a major part of that. Some of our work contributes in writing some of the stories. Some of that actually is part of work we've done, and with the help of many people based here on the Corn Belt, and how that's part of writing that chapter in the histories of commodities. The question becomes what do you do about it? In Marxism, if it's a teleological story of narrating technological success and the domination of nature, it's kind of foreclosing the possibilities to a story that is already told and is bound to be repeated. So where do you intervene in that story? And maybe a branch of magical Marxism is not bad in that. So to evoke the power of imagination, to close your eyes and dreams a bit. There's a wonderful book by Andy Merrifield on the legacy of the humanist in Marx that is foreclosed by the kind of an older, kind of a more Althusserlian version of Marx. But Marx is also a possibility for us to think about change first and foremost, and to imagine that possibility of a change. So if we are capitalizing on that power of the imagination, then there's maybe part of that conversation that comes back again. So I'll just leave it there.
I think there would be a large difference between the criticality of your project and its location in the domestic, and the kind of, you know, with the sort of nest thing, you know, your own thermostat and your ability to kind of change the world through your thermostat. And I think it's that difference, actually, which is very important to preserve in this discussion. So it's not about not engaging the domestic, it's about preserving that distance between the easiness of a kind of solution presented and the visibility of certain kinds of, or the illusion of controllability around, and even around calorie counts, right? And something that pushes against that. And I would imagine your project is absolutely about preserving that productive distance.
Yeah, that should be. We have one more question. So with this, I unfortunately was only able to see the morning session and not the afternoon session. But with the main question of the conference, what is the urban and registers of the world interior, I was wondering what your thoughts were about really the internet or this virtual, like it's almost like another layer of interior that's developed in the last 20 years, and I'm wondering how you feel that impacts what you're doing, right? Like we're in skywalks and we're not even aware that we're in skywalks because we're on our phones. And so do you think that makes it harder, like with the issue of care? Does that make it more challenging, or is it actually a way that people are coming more or being more exposed to the exterior? And I guess the internet is social media, is that some form of the urban as well? And how does that fit into the conversation?
I can stab it, except for I'm supposed to be moderator. But I can take a stab at that because it's an interesting question. In my research, it's become clear that the suburbs would have never happened in the 1950s without a telephone and a television. Right? There has been for a while now, not just the internet accelerated it for sure, but there's been a symbiotic relationship between urban form and the cul-de-sacking of the American city, which I'll talk about in 20 minutes, and technology and communication technology. And I don't think it's an either or that the virtual. I think the problem is trying to stack the virtual against the material, which we often do, that the virtual somehow is going to supplant the material. But in fact, to look at the relationship between the two, the dynamic between the two, how the material responds to changes is prodded by the virtual or by electronic communication or even by automobiles, right? And vice versa, how the material plays back into that. And I think it's a fascinating dynamic. I think that's why people are so flipped out over self-driving cars, although I'm not quite sure. The exploring that relationship is, I think, probably one of the, it's certainly if we're thinking about the material world, which we are in a design conference and concerned with the physical environment, it's the frontier where we would be, where we would find, I think, our most productive work. There's not an answer to that. I don't have an answer to that other than to say it's not a this and that or an either or a very simple relationship between the virtual communication and physical or material communication. But it's a fantastic topic, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity, actually.
Yep. Just a few
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add something to that, but I find it harder and harder to relate to this image that we used to have in the 90s, that the internet and the virtual world is something that you need to isolate yourself from the physical world, in the room of your house, to go to the virtual world. These are two different things. I think more and more, especially with all the geolocation services that are happening, I think that the virtual and the physical are blending together in an absolutely fascinating way. I think I cannot really imagine that they are separate entities anymore. It's just a layer of information that is being added to the physical world.
So I'm going to, if that's okay, just change the topic for a second and maybe pose a question or something that's coming to mind for me that we can maybe take into tomorrow if we don't answer it today. But when I'm thinking about this image of the aquarium, I'm thinking about poverty housing, right? And particularly what I look at, which isn't the physical so much as systems of poverty management. But the movement has been to take the public housing towers right down and then push people into mixed income communities, into being neighbors, into proximity. And so I just wonder how that challenges these ideas or these metaphors that we're bringing up right now, and if there might perhaps be some categories that we need to think about or differentiate as we move forward into tomorrow.
Thanks. I think we probably are run out of time, and I want to leave everyone, especially Albert, time to have a coffee and think and prepare himself for the lecture, which he'll give in 17 minutes back here. So thank you all very much, and thank you very much.